And our job is to really act as a city's watchdog or ombudsperson, and essentially oversee the agencies that the mayor, that report to the mayor. So whether it's the police department, the buildings department, the health department, or any agency, our job is to oversee them. And, if there's complaints about city services, for example, the trash isn't being picked up, or, there's a building, roof collapse and the city's not responding, or whatever the service is, if that's not being competently responded to, our job is to then push the agency to resolve those complaints. We also have the power to pass laws, and I'll talk a bunch about that on this webinar. We can introduce bills into the city council and pass them into law if we persuade the council and the mayor to support whatever bill we're pushing. We also have a big unit called Constituent Services, which also deals with casework. So I talked about complaints. Those complaints go to that division to help resolve. So it's a big office, an important office, and I'm happy to be First Deputy Public Advocate, which is the #2 person in the agency, helping Jimani set the vision, his vision for the city, and help push us in that direction. So I look forward to talking about some of the issues in a few minutes. Thanks.
Perfect. So let's move on to the next question. Nancy?
Yeah, so that all sounds great. So how did your career in politics and civic engagement really start? And are there any issues with voting that you've seen in this time or any time before that could be addressed?
Sure. So my career in politics began when I was about 15. So I hate to say this, but literally 20 years ago, I was 15. And I was in high school. And at that time, there was another big national election happening. At that time, it was George Bush, Al Gore as the competitors. And, George Bush won the election. What I saw back then was particularly people of color, Black folks in particular, actually, in Florida, being disenfranchised. In fact, you may have read about or heard about hanging chads or dimpled chads for that election. And what it meant was when folks in Florida, like Broward County, Miami-Dade County, went to go cast a ballot, they would attempt to vote, and those ballots would be discarded because the chad, the little thing that you punch that falls out of the paper when you punch it, wasn't fully disconnected. So there were thousands of votes that had that issue that were discarded. On top of that, the Supreme Court stopped the count. So to kind of be brief on how I got started, that was the beginning for me. I thought there was no way in a democracy that we are, a democratic republic, that people are not allowed to engage in the vote. And then let alone the issues of race and class. We began this country, at least Black folks did, as slaves and counted as 3/5 of people. And then, once we got past that 13th Amendment, then we have to deal with, getting the right to vote. So that was the beginning for me. I went to college at UC Berkeley, got involved in politics, learned back then how to, I really gained my voice and identity, I think, in college. I was privileged to be appointed to a couple of commissions that help actually write laws out there in Berkeley, Cali, where I went to college. And that's a lot of experience super early, right? I moved to New York. I've worked for a few elected officials, and now I'm happy to be First Deputy, where my passion really is bringing about systemic policy change. And I'll just give you one example. We're dealing with an era of justice reform, and our office is very much part and parcel of helping to push reform at the city, state, and federal level. Mostly the city, some state, a little federal, but so we're active on all three levels of government. So that's how I got started, and that's kind of what I'm doing now. And your second question was about what am I seeing in terms of voting over and over. I'll just be straight. This country hasn't gotten it right still when it comes to making sure that people can vote. And we see right now forces, and I don't want to be partisan here, but we have certain political parties trying to suppress what I think is suppress the vote. And really what I think is unfortunately a sort of notion of racism and sexism, assuming that certain groups of people will vote in a certain way, and therefore let's stop them from voting so that a particular party can win. That is voter suppression. It is, to me, un-American. It continues. But let's not assume that that's one party. There are issues with both parties when it comes to voting. In New York City alone, we've seen in recent years, for example, if you live in Brooklyn, you may have seen news reports in the last couple of elections that your name may have been wiped from the voter rolls and you didn't know it. So when you went to show up on election day, the poll worker telling you, hey, nice to see you, you're not registered to vote. Bye. Right? So there's a lot of issues when it comes to voting. There's issues with poll sites. There's not enough poll sites, not only in New York City, but across the country. So there's just a bunch of issues with the process. And I think it's up to us to, one, be aware of those issues, and two, push to solve those problems. So I hope that gets to your two-part question.
It does. Thank you so much for that.
Sure.
Please.
So as a follow-up question, what would you say the most important issues that you think, either from your experience or in your role as the first deputy public advocate, needs to be addressed in the current election?
Yes, I also love that question. And I want to be super blunt and open. As a Black person in this country, I wake up and turn on the TV and often see news reports that are sad. Most recently, in terms of activism and policy and politics, we woke up to see the murder of George Floyd by police officers. In New York City, we saw the murder of Eric Garner. Point being, it's up to us. It's up to all of us, not just those who are victims of police violence, but it's up to all of us, one, to recognize that this is a national, it continues to be a national problem. And we got to figure out, no matter where we sit, whether with the city government, state government, or the federal government, how to stop people of color from being killed by police. That is a critical issue that affects, all of us. We're in the middle of also another just devastating pandemic. COVID-19 has ravaged not just the city, but this whole country. I've never experienced lived through a pandemic like this. There was Zika, there was H1N1, but this is just a whole new situation. We're all working, or many of us are working from home. There are those of us who have to go to work, have to leave because it may be essential workers. But this is it's rough. So on those actually two big issues, it's up to the candidates at the federal level, state level, and local level to address. And I've got to give some credit to my colleagues in the Public Advocate's Office who've been studying what's been happening with COVID-19. And here's what we've been finding, and it's not a surprise, unfortunately. When it comes to hospitalizations for COVID-19, when it comes to positive tests for COVID-19, when it comes to deaths, when we talk about COVID-19, and when we talk about frontline workers, so those who, when we pause or quarantine at home, those folks who still have to go to work, all those people, not surprisingly, are people of color, Black and Latino New Yorkers, Black and Latino Americans. Why is that a problem? Think about the response. Number one, we know that in terms of the hospitalizations, the positive tests, and the frontline workers, it's systemic. So this is another example of how systemic racism hurts, in particular, people of color and women, by the way. So it's devastating. So those are two core issues. When we talk about solutions on COVID, this isn't a 1 day, 1 week, 1 month solution. It's identifying what are the systemic issues that we need to tackle. Number one, under COVID, is healthcare. We saw the federal government pass the Affordable Care Act many years ago. That was to some a step forward, to others a step backward in terms of political ideology. But there is a fact that about 30 million people did get healthcare because of that act. But even with those number of people getting health insurance, that's not universal coverage. So when COVID really ramped up in March, April, May, we saw folks going to the hospital who didn't have health insurance, or those who went to the hospital were covered but still got bills for whatever the procedures were that may not have been covered by their insurance. That is a huge issue, and that is why I think people of color were hit the hardest, because we unfortunately are higher on the list of lacking healthcare. So if I had to sum it up in terms of all these candidates, It is responding to police violence across the country, reimagining what we call public safety. That isn't sending police into every interaction. It's sending our dollars to other social services to prevent interactions in the first place. I'll give you an example. If it's a mental health issue, we should not be sending police to those 911 calls. We should have a separate phone number and send peers or those who are not folks with a badge and a gun to those calls. So it's justice system reform, including police violence, and it is really responding to the systemic inequities we see with COVID-19. Those are the two big things right now.
Yeah, so those are definitely some great points that you've made, and a lot of them are calls of action that we've been hearing a lot from the community in New York City. So going on to our fourth question. So what are some goals that young leaders should have in mind when engaging in civic roles? I believe your mic is muted.
Sorry about that. My phone is acting up for some reason. My apologies. That was a little crazy. My apologies. So could you just repeat the question? Sorry about that.
Yeah, what are some goals that young leaders should have in mind when engaging in these civic roles in order to make change?
Yeah, I think the starting point really is having a sense of identity and voice. I think, as I mentioned, I got my start very young in terms of finding my voice. I think, as college students in particular, don't think that just because you aren't elected or appointed to a career or have a job, that you don't have a voice. There are many outlets that you should be sort of taking advantage of to speak out on these issues. So I think among all the sort of possibilities, it's finding your voice and using your voice, like folks on this call are doing tonight. And I'll give you one core example. New York City, there's something called community boards. And these are places where residents, I think starting at age 16, can sign up and vote on issues that affect their local community. So whether it's a building going up that you object to that may be closing down mom and pop stores, or if you see schools that are underperforming, or whatever the local issues are, that's a place where you can go and speak out and push for change. Also, don't think that you can't yourself run for office if you do the right work. There is a new assemblyman elect in Far Rockaway named Khalil Anderson. Khalil is about 23, 24 years old. He's in your generation. He's now about to go to the state assembly as a lawmaker. So don't think that, because of where you are right now, that you yourself can't, join up and make change. So find your identity and find the outlet to identity and voice, and find the outlet to, really push about the policy change that you want to see, whether it's student debt, I know we're talking about debt later on, whether it's housing issues, whether it's education issues, whatever it is, you right now have the power to make change. It isn't about folks who have a title or whatever it is. You right now are those who can make the change. And I'm happy that, folks are on this call to see that through. Thanks for the question.
Yes, of course. I think that's really important, especially as students that we know that we have the right to, and we have the call to really enforce changes, especially in our communities or wherever we may be. Moving on to question 5 now. So over the last 6 months, we talked about the need for a call to change in the community, especially in the city. So how can we turn all these calls to change into actionable reform, criminal justice reform in this specific election season, and not just make it be a call for change without an implementation of policy or real change?
Yep. Another good question. I just got finished saying that you have the power to make that change, and you're asking me like, okay, well, how do I do it? So in New York City, there are 51 members of the city council, and they represent every neighborhood in the city. One, get to know who your current council member is. These are the elected officials that can, at the local level, at the city level, enact laws that, changes that you want to see. Same thing at the state level. There are state senators and state assembly members. Figure out who they are. And of course, you got members of Congress and of course, the president and the White House. Just the starting point is know who your current elected officials are and know where they sit. So for example, you should know that if you live in Bed-Stuy, the councilman there is named Robert Cornegy. He chairs the housing committee in the city council. The housing committee deals with tenant harassment issues or various housing issues. Get to know him. If you have a housing complaint, call your council member, but also know who the chair of the committee is. That's Robert Cornegy. So knowledge is, and I know this is going to be cliche, but it has to be said, knowledge really is power. If you know who sits in seats of power, you can push them directly. Secondarily, you know, earlier I mentioned about your identity and voice. I'm continually impressed by the ability of us to bring about change through our voice on social media. Never discount the ability to make aware those in power issues like war and peace, issues like housing, issues like justice reform. And, you know, like talking to affinity groups and speaking out on, you know, those platforms are also another powerful way of building a critical mass to the things that you want to see. So one, I would say, you know, get to know your elected officials. Two, use your voice yourself on those platforms. If you are a writer, think about writing op-eds on your issues. You can right now be published. I started writing op-eds when I was about 21, 22. I've been published on different topics. I can't recall all the topics back then, but it was definitely stuff about housing and just other political issues. So you yourself have a voice. Know your local papers. For example, if you live in Harlem, there's a paper called the Amsterdam News. They will accept your well-written, you know, well-researched op-eds and publish them. You yourself, again, the point is you have a voice, and you should use your voice now to push those in power. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I think those are all really great points, especially getting young leaders involved from a social platform to a more political published platform. So I think that's
Right.
all. Moving on to question 6. So
Yep.
we've talked about the different voting plans, especially here in New York City. But how can leaders create voting plans and help others to create their own voting plans as well to get involved within the next 4 days to go out and vote?
Yeah, this is an interesting question because, again, those in power don't make it easier for us to vote. I talked about issues of polling places. We don't even have in New York City online voter registration, which makes no sense. Like you should right now be able to go online and register from wherever you live and not need to, you know, go to any place or mail anything back. You should do it online. If you have a state ID, that's a code on an ID card. You should do it online. That's a big flaw. So that's kind of how I think I think I would address it. Does that get to it, or do you have any specific sort of like a sub question to that one?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think that's a great way for young leaders to really get started and getting their votes counted.
Yeah. Oh, let me add one thing. I'm sorry. So there's also a website where you, for example, I know we're in COVID, and many people are encouraging folks to vote by mail, and that is what it is. If you do that, check out the New York City's Board of Election website, where you can track your actual ballot. So if you vote by mail, you may not have a clue as to, you know, was the ballot received, et cetera. Just go to Google and type in, you know, NYC Board of Election and check out how you can track your ballot. That's also an important way to just to be aware that your vote counts.
Definitely. Thank you for that. Tazia, you can go ahead with question 7.
Yes, so sorry guys, my mic wasn't working for a few, but Nick, I'll definitely make sure to put that in the chat in the end so they can press that. For our last question, it says, the richest 1% of Americans who owns about 35% of the nation's wealth. The bottom 80% own less than 11% of the nation's wealth. However, instead of taxing the wealthy, the government has cut funding for education, affordable housing, and Medicare. Do you think that this path of taxation is sustainable?
Good one. Very good one. No. Let's start here when it comes to taxation and when it comes to debt and deficit. And we're talking about money and money. We're talking about really budgets, and budget is a thing where we figure out what we spend for what program, right? We've got to get real, right? We got to start. Let's be blunt from my point of view. We got to start taxing the rich. There are about 119 billionaires in the, I think, city of New York, and during COVID-19, their wealth, believe it or not, increased by about $70 billion, if I have my numbers correct. That's during COVID-19. What does that mean? They saw that the airline stocks went down and you know, a bunch of stocks dropped, and they did what's called shorting those stocks, for example, and they made money off of our misery, basically. So while we were having to stay home and quarantine, you know, these hedge fund managers and, you know, wealthy New Yorkers were increasing their net worth based on the suffering of New Yorkers. Doesn't that sound crazy? Well, that's been what's happening. So my theory is, and there's a bunch of bills in Albany, we've got to start taxing some of that stuff and then putting that money into programs that we know will, for example, reduce gun violence, or fund our schools, or fund a revamped mental health system. Because let's be clear, you know, we can't just print money that would cause, you know, stuff like inflation when talk about like economics and budgets. But we know that the rich do not pay their fair share. For example, you may have, and not to pick on the president, but just as a really clear example, he's a self-proclaimed billionaire. And if that's true, he pays a lower effective tax rate than, for example, whoever he would hire to, you know, clean his buildings or hotels. That's a problem. And because that's the case, we're lacking funds that should be going to, you know, worthy programs like funding a real education system, or when I talked about COVID-19, making sure that all Americans have adequate and affordable health care. So I think as a policy matter, we should really be taxing the rich, and the state legislature have a bunch of bills that will do so. Budgets to me are moral documents, and they are up to, you know, they're set by the executive. So the president sets a budget with Congress, the governor sets a budget with the legislature, and the mayor sets a budget with the city council. The city budget, by the way, is something along the lines of $90 billion. The city budget for the city of New York is about $90 billion. Half of that is to healthcare and pensions, but that leaves you about 30 to 35 to $40 billion to fund services we need. So another example, austerity, meaning, you know, when budgets get tight, these executives are feeling like, oh, we need to cut back on spending for SYEP. No, that's the last thing you do when you're in a budget crisis. That is exactly when you want to invest in these kinds of programs. You want to invest in CUNY. Fun fact, Bernie Sanders, you all may have heard of Bernie Sanders. He went to Brooklyn College. Bernie Sanders, when he went to Brooklyn College, paid, you know how much in tuition? Donut hole, $0. CUNY was free 30 or 40 years ago. Now there are thousands of dollars a year in tuition, the room and board. And that's a problem. Because, and actually, if you look at even further back before Bernie, if you go back to the Great Depression, I think it's the Great Depression, if I have my facts fully accurate on this, CUNY was still free. And that was a place where during the Depression and during the wars, New Yorkers signed up en masse to go to CUNY to gain further skills that they could then use to support their families. So, you know, when we talk about budgets as more documents, CUNY is the last thing we should be cutting, because you get a fantastic education, and you set up, as you all know, you set up New Yorkers and folks who come here to go to CUNY up to not just earn good wages, but support their families. So I hope that gets to your question about budgets. It's really important that even though we are, you know, the stock market's up and down, we're in a sort of a crisis because of COVID and other things, that we don't take money away from the core things that matter. Support to invest in those things. And one last thing I'll mention when it comes to budgets and justice reform, folks talk a lot about divest, invest. So pull money from the police department and send it to those programs. You all may have seen the news. The mayor and the council passed a budget in June. So every year the city council and the mayor pass a budget, which sets spending priorities. And they allegedly cut $1 billion from the police department, which advocates have been calling for. But turns out there were some maneuvers made, which in effect wasn't a real cut. The unfortunate part there is, again, that's money that could be going to other programs and even policy initiatives like getting cops out of schools. So when I talk budget, budget is also a matter of policy. We should be getting cops out of schools. So we should fund those school safety agents into other career options so that we reduce the school to prison pipeline. So once again, to the thesis or to the premise here, budgets are moral documents, and money we spend tells us and tells New Yorkers what our priorities are. And as a public advocate's office, our priority is to ensure that we, one, have a real reduction in the police department budget and send that money into these programs we are talking about, including, by the way, CUNY. So I hope that gets to your question about budgets.
Yes, absolutely, it does. I did read that article as well, where the city budget, police department budget was cut, but only $486 million of it was actually cut, not necessarily.
Yep.
So that's
Yep.
actually really interesting.
Yep.
Yeah, so now when we talk about policies and how these policies can really be implemented, how can we help to alleviate the stress of the growing national deficit on students like ourselves and generations to come when talking about fiscal policy, whether on a state or federal level?
Yep. I would definitely start with the federal level because they have the biggest impact when it comes to the dollars that we spend. And so I'll be a little bit repetitive, but I'll try to add on to it. I think, again, when it comes to the federal, state, and local levels, budgets are moral documents. And again, just because we are in a crisis doesn't mean we shouldn't fund needed services. So, but to execute that point, this goes back to your earlier question, I think, about voice and identity and making change. There are 435 members of the federal House of Representatives. There are 100 members of the Senate. In New York State, there's Senator Schumer, Senator Gillibrand, and depending on where you are, you may have Congressmember Nadler, Clark, Vasquez, etc. These people work with the White House, and the party here does actually play a part. So it's important to know who stands for what, when, and why. They work together to set a federal budget. There's something called the the Iraq War, which has been going on since, I think, 2003 now. So what is that, 17 years? The Iraq War has now cost this country $2 trillion. Remember what I said, budgets are moral documents. Every year, members of both parties continue to fund, for example, the Iraq War. Now, we can debate just or not just, but the reality is, does it make sense to spend $2 trillion on a war that is seen as controversial without really not much pushback? At least I don't see pushback, and I haven't seen pushback in this presidential campaign. A piece of that money can go, for example, to universal health care. So I mentioned the Affordable Care Act earlier, but that didn't get us all the way. I think we as a matter of policy, this isn't about party, as a matter of policy, do need to reach a universal health care because it is a cliche, but it's true. Health care is a right and not a privilege. It is a right. And so it's up to us when we talk about budgets and we talk about deficit, again, not cutting these programs, but investing in these programs and ensuring that we push the federal government and state government and city government, all levels of government set budgets. Remember that all these budgets, government set budgets, push them to fund priorities that we know are moral and just and right.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And Tasso, before you get to the last question, just a general information for everyone on this call. Currently, the national budget for military spending is over 53% of the United States' current budget. That includes education, healthcare, Medicare, and all these other essential social programs that really should be invested in greater.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead. You can answer that last question.
So yeah, the last question is to student loans. It's about student loans. Student loans
Mhm.
is the first bill many college students will receive after graduation. There are over $1.5 trillion in student loan debt. How can government, state, local, or federal create policies and action plans that ensure that students are receiving quality education without the hefty price tag?
Yep, love this question, and I think we've seen a bunch of candidates at the federal level talk about this. And again, I don't want to get into political party, but I think folks have a sense of who's where on this issue when it comes to student debt. You know, the public advocate himself and our whole team does support tuition-free college and university, particularly when it comes to public colleges and universities. But really, as a matter of ideology, private as well. But you know, they set their own policies there. Sorry about that. So it is really up to you know, the candidates to say where they stand on this issue and to enact those policies. So you know, we're about to go vote on November 3rd. Ask yourself which candidate, and that's any party, not just D or R, but any of the parties, which candidate is more apt to push for tuition-free public colleges and universities. And if that is, you know, a policy that you agree with, then it probably makes sense to support that candidate. But even, I'm being vague here for a reason because I'm not trying to be partisan, but it is true that even if someone says tuition-free college university, that may not, you know, mean that you pay $0. For example, going to CUNY, you should be paying $0 because education, again, it should be is a right, not a privilege. So even when the person gets into office, let's say they agree with you partially, or they disagree with you, or you think they fully agree with you, nevertheless, stay involved and push them. Stay involved and push them. If somebody mentioned WFP, yeah, WFP is a New York state political party, and you have the option to vote for candidates on WFP or Democratic line or Republican line, conservative line, etc. So you know, you get informed to make your choice about what party. But you know, and again, on the line of get informed, be aware of who stands where, and whoever again is more apt to say, yeah, I think that like students have a huge debt load. We should be canceling student debt, and we should be making sure that we have tuition-free college, university. That's the person that, you know, it seems to make sense without pushing anyone to vote for one person. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And with that, kind of concludes our questions and answer sessions. Now we're going to be moving into the open discussion. So if there's anyone on this call who has any questions for the first deputy, please feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat or just ask them out loud.
Sure. And I saw a couple of questions in the chat about WFP, and I couldn't see the other ones, but they kind of flashed. And while you're looking, I'll just let folks know if folks have, you know, issues that you would like the public advocate or our team to engage in, like policy reform, or you have a complaint about, you know, an issue, you can check out our site at advocate.nyc.gov or send us an email at gethelp@advocate.nyc.gov. And then personally, my Twitter is Nick E. Smith NYC, so you can also send me a note there, and I'll be happy to talk to folks.
Yeah, one of the participants, Jacqueline, she sent this really great resource sheet for the New York Coalition. They're hosting free training and phone call banks to reach out to voters. So I'm just gonna reshare that in the chat with everyone.
Awesome, that's great.
Okay, so I guess if there's no questions or comments,
There's
what
one
I have a
more.
question.
oh, there's one more? Okay. Oh,
You talked about earlier about how you could go to the wait, there's actually a question up too, I think. But you talked earlier about my thing is not on. You talked earlier about going first to, you said, a chair of committee. What would you say is the best way of approaching that?
Yep, good question. So having worked as a staffer for the city council, actually for Jemina when he was a council member, there's no rule book. I would just say, for example, if you have complaints about, if you want to like help change taxes and recommend who should be taxed at what rate, for example, if you have that knowledge, Or if you just want to say like, I don't have all the detail here, but you're the experts, tax the rich. Just know that at the city level, it's harder to deal with taxes. That's more of a state issue. So you want to figure out who your state senator and your state assembly person is. They are the ones that can pass the tax bills and laws. And how you do it, you can just literally pick up the phone and call their office in either in Albany or in their district office. So they typically have the Albany folks. The state lawmakers have two offices, one in Albany State Capitol and one in their districts. So you can call the district office or the Albany office and say, hey, I'm interested in making sure that CUNY is fully funded. I know that one way we can fully fund CUNY and, eliminate tuition, hopefully in the short term, but, longer term is, why don't y'all figure out how to tax folks who are not paying their fair share of taxes, state lawmakers. So you can tax unrealized capital gains. Let's call it, I think it's a transfer tax. There's a bunch of them. And I can send folks more information about different taxes. But their job, though, is to tell you those options, right? So it's not only you asking them for information, it's them being like, okay, we're in the government, we're staffers, let us tell you where we stand and give you, the menu as to things we think should happen. And in return, you tell us what you think we should be doing. So does that get to it a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah, just pick up the phone or tweet them, call them, go to, not during COVID, of course, but once we get through COVID, just show up at their office. Hey, I'm Nick, I'm a student at X school. I'm gonna talk about a housing issue or whatever. Their job is to listen and help direct you into the right path. So it could be recommending to them a new law. It could be recommending to them a nonprofit in their district that they should fund. For example, in terms of gun violence reduction, which I didn't get to talk about yet, there's a really amazing system called the Crisis Management System, CMS. And what CMS does is it sends folks who have been, who may have made a mistake in their lives before or who have had justice involvement before. And these are mostly men who are, on the street engaging with our young people and explaining, hey, we know you may have a beef on this issue or struggle with, a certain problem. Picking up a gun is not, a solution. So why don't you talk to us and we'll deal with mentors. We'll see if we can help you get a job, et cetera. And that should be clear. That's not just for men. It's boys and girls, men and women. And part of the program also sends conflict mediators into middle schools, actually. And another part of it is they have SYEP, summer youth jobs, as well as a part of the program. That's one example as to how you can ask your city council people, hey, I'm really excited by this Cure Violence movement. I know that that's the way that we can help reduce gun violence. Are you pushing to the mayor to increase funding for Cure Violence programs? If you're not, why aren't you? How much is the program now, et cetera? So that's how you can just talk to your electors at the city level, state level, and federal level. And don't be surprised that, if you just walk into their office, that you actually see the elected themselves and have a minute to talk to them directly. They work for you. Their taxpayer dollars are your taxpayer dollars. And so, their salaries are your taxpayer dollars. So they work for you. And so you have the right to ask for policy change, budget change, or assistance from any of them.
Yes, most definitely. I think that's something that we all in this class should really keep in mind. So we have a question from Ken. He said that considering you brought up taxing the rich even more, what is stopping them from moving their holdings to a foreign country to avoid being taxed?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me repeat the premise. The wealthy in this city and in this country do not pay their per capita fair share of taxes. That's my starting point when I think about taxation. And nobody wants to pay taxes, but we have a social contract to meet, which is our taxes fund critical services, particularly for those of least means, but also for other people. Roads, bridges, tunnels, street lights, all that stuff is taxpayer dollars. So if we look at it from that framework, yeah, those with more means should be willing to fund, fully fund our social contract. I'm less worried about, wealthy people packing up and leaving New York City. The president himself, changed his residency to Florida. All right, but the reality is you got to pay federal tax. Well, you should be paying federal taxes, state taxes, and local taxes. And you also shouldn't be hijacking the tax code, particularly the federal level, and ensuring that you pay less taxes per capita than your secretary or someone who makes 50, 60, 70, whatever K a year. So this is really a moral argument. And, I reject out of hand the idea that rich folks are going to go, leave the country or leave the state if you tax them more. In fact, you're not going to avoid taxes altogether, because nations, by and large, fund their services in a very similar structure. And there are places around the world where the tax rates, for example, corporate rates, are much higher than what you'd pay here. And in fact, even in this country, the rates are much lower than what corporations used to pay 50 years ago. The tax rate used to be something like 60, 70%. You can debate that, but to cry wolf or to foul because of dependent taxes, no, it's really about profit and greed. And let's remember, we've got to meet the social contract and also pay our fair share, whether we make 50K or 500K or $5 billion a year.
Most definitely. I think those are all really important ideas to consider, especially as we go out to vote in these next few days if we have not voted already. So, Nick E. Smith, we thank you so much.
One more question. We have one last question by Lucia. She asks, my question is, what advice would you give to someone who thinks that their one vote doesn't matter?
That is a really great closing question. I will say this: there is plenty of evidence to question whether your vote will count, especially now during COVID-19, where we're voting by mail, and there's controversy as to whether it'll reach the polling place or not. Whether if you when you sign the document, whether or not they'll reject your ballot because your signature doesn't match. And those are all barriers by those in power. And again, I'm not picking on one party. I'm talking about both parties. That's a way that parties stop people from voting. And our job is to push back against that. So, for example, I personally have been telling folks, if you're not immunocompromised and healthy enough, vote in person. Even if it's absentee, drop the ballot off. That helps better ensure that your vote will be counted. And I also mentioned the ability to check the status of your ballot if you happen to have to mail it, because it is true. There are New Yorkers who are not able to leave their home and vote because of a health issue. But be optimistic. Know that we, and I'm talking about all of us on this call, have the ability to stop this voter suppression. I know that we saw a Supreme Court justice confirmed, and there's an assumption that they'd be regressive on issues of voting rights. We'll see. But even if that's the case, we have to continue to speak up, speak out, because if we don't, those people who are trying to stop us from voting will succeed, and we can't let that happen.
Yes, so if that is all the questions. Hope I'm not speaking too soon again. We thank you so much for coming out to our event today. I think you've imparted some great wisdom on everyone on this call, even if it was just a last minute encouragement to get everyone else out to vote if they haven't done so already. Is there any information you'd like to leave to anyone for the office or yourself?
Yeah, I do. So my email is nsmith@advocate.nyc.gov. My Twitter is Nick E. Smith NYC, and our website is advocate.nyc.gov. I'm always happy to talk to anyone, and particularly CUNY students, about career options, or just talk to folks about career paths. And I'll be straight, I'm not that many years older. I'm 35, and I'm not that much removed. So I'm able to really remember just a couple of years ago having to pay tuition and figure out how all that works. And so any advice needed, I'm very happy to talk to anyone. And I also want to give a shout out to my colleague who's on the call, Daniel Garcia McGuire.
You're on mute.
Hopefully it cut off her when you introduced him, but yeah.
See, that was a quick cut. Hey guys, I'm Benny. Hey Nick, you're back. Okay.
Sorry about that. I'm back. This phone is just whoo.
No, yeah.
Well, yeah, Danny, go ahead and introduce yourself. And if there's any other colleagues on, feel free to introduce yourself as well before we jump off.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah, appreciate it. So yeah, CUNY is amazing. Really appreciate everyone here, and always learn something from Nick. So I was happy to be on, and just really appreciate the youth power here, because y'all are already doing it. So we're learning from you, and happy to help. Again, we do work for you, so blow us up, and make sure that we're listening. Very happy to.
Absolutely. Don't forget, vote November 3rd. Remember, early voting is on now, so you can show up. Check out our site, and you can see the early voting hours. I don't want to misstate the hours, but do make sure you vote. And I recommend, as a matter of practice, you may know folks who haven't voted or are not likely to. Just remind them it's critically important to speak out. And I'm sorry for the tech issues. I'll get that fixed, and I hope to come back and talk to folks on this call more. But thank you all so much, and I really appreciate the time.
Yeah, so with that being said, we will be sending out a follow-up email with all of the information for the Deputy Public Advocate's Office, as well as Nick's information, and anyone else information that you may need, as well as a voting guide. And also, don't forget, I'm sending the link again. Please make sure that you RSVP for this event so that you can join our wrap. With that being said, we thank you so much in the students of the Deputy Public Advocate's Office for coming out today and just hosting this amazing, wonderful event.
Great. Thanks again. I really appreciate your time. This was fantastic.
Thank you. With that being said, everyone have a great evening.
One announcement about the raffle contest for our classmates, fellow peers. The raffle contest for the AirPods or the $180 gift card, it will be announced Monday on Instagram. Our Instagram is up to Baruch, so make sure you keep an eye on that. I'll paste it on the chat, and then if you win, you'll see it on our Instagram.
Yeah. So everyone have a great evening, and we hope to see you soon, hopefully at a next event or somewhere on the gram. Have a great evening, everyone.